The day was June 21st, 1945. The vast, deep blue of the Atlantic Ocean was deceptively calm, a serene mirror to the sky above. But the ship that sliced through its waters was anything but peaceful. It carried a human cargo, and within that cargo, a storm of silent disbelief and muted fear was brewing. On the deck, dozens of women stood huddled together, their figures lost inside shapeless, gray uniforms. They leaned against the cold metal railings, their eyes, accustomed to the gray skies of a broken Europe, now struggling to adjust to the endless horizon of water. This was a voyage into profound uncertainty. They were prisoners of war, a collection of women who had served the German war machine in its final, sputtering years. They had been clerks, typists who once documented orders with cold efficiency, nurses who had tended to the wounded of a failing cause, and in some cases, women who had been staff at the camps that now haunted the conscience of the world. Some had embraced the ideology with fervent belief. Others had simply been caught in the unforgiving current of circumstance, seeking survival in a world that offered few choices. Now, ideology and circumstance were irrelevant. They were bound by a single, crushing identity: defeat. They were exiles, their futures a terrifyingly blank page. Their destination was America, a name that felt more like a myth than a place. In their minds, they painted pictures of what awaited them, drawing from the only reality they knew. They expected a reflection of their own ruined homeland, but with the roles reversed. They imagined stone barracks behind fences of razor wire. They anticipated punishment, a cold and methodical retribution for their nation's sins. In hushed, anxious whispers, they rehearsed the humiliation they were certain was coming. Would they be paraded through the streets of American cities, their faces exposed to the scorn of the victors? Would the soldiers mock their accents, their exhaustion, their defeat? Some carried fragments of fear that were sharper and more gnawing than hunger itself. Rumors, passed in the dark holds of the ship, grew into nightmarish certainties. Tales of Allied vengeance, whispers of hard labor in sprawling, unforgiving fields. They envisioned America as a more efficient devastation here. No buildings were flattened into piles of rubble. No faces bore the gaunt, hollowed-out lines of starvation. The German women stood frozen, transfixed by the scene. Suddenly, their own hollow cheeks, their patched and faded sleeves, seemed grotesquely out of place in this world teeming with life. One of them, a girl no older than 22, leaned toward her companion, her voice a barely audible whisper. "It looks like a dream," she muttered. "Or a lie." Her friend simply shrugged, her face a pale mask of confusion beneath her headscarf. None of them could yet grasp the simple, staggering truth. For America, the war had been a distant storm, fought oceans away. When the ship finally docked, and the women were guided ashore, they clutched their small, pathetic bundles, a pair of spare stockings, a faded photograph, perhaps a single comb. They followed the line of soldiers, their boots echoing on the wooden pier, their minds braced for the next phase of their humiliation. And then it happened. It was just a flash of movement, a ripple of color in the corner of their vision. At first, they dismissed it as a trick of the light, an illusion born of fatigue. But then the image sharpened, solidifying into an impossible reality. There on the pier, strolling with an unhurried grace, as if the greatest war in human history had never happened, was an American woman. She was wearing a skirt, not a uniform, not a practical drab garment, but a calf-length skirt made of bright, patterned cloth. She carried a handbag, and the confident click of her heels on the wooden planks was a sound from another world. As she walked, the sunlight caught the pleats of her skirt, making them ripple like water. The column of prisoners faltered. Their heavy boots clattered to a sudden, ragged halt. A guard barked an order, sharp and impatient, for them to keep moving. But the image was already burned into their minds. It was an image of simple, breathtaking freedom. No gray uniform, no patches from a flour sack, no sign of rationing or utility. Just color, just choice, just a skirt. To them, it was more shocking than any weapon. It was impossible. The prisoners craned their necks, their eyes wide, their silence broken only by sharp, involuntary gasps. They were witnesses to a civilization that had not been touched by rubble, a world where women were still adorned with color, while their own had been stripped down to the bones of survival. One prisoner pressed her face against the rough canvas of the truck, her voice trembling with a question that was part accusation, part awe. "Do they not know there was a war?" Another woman, her face a mask of bitterness, answered without turning. "Perhaps," she said, "it's because they won." The remark hung in the air, a truth that no one could deny. The trucks rumbled past billboards that advertised things so trivial, so utterly mundane, they seemed insane. Soap, chewing gum. Luxuries that were beyond imagination in Germany were here, printed in giant letters for all to see. At intersections, American soldiers waved casually at the trucks, some even tipping their hats to passing women. The prisoners' hearts pounded with a dizzying confusion. Were these the vengeful victors they had been taught to fear? These Americans looked neither cruel nor impoverished. They simply looked alive. Even within the confines of the trucks, the air began to carry new smells, wafting in from bakeries and kitchens along the streets. The aroma of fresh bread, sweet, white, and soft, filled the air. For years, hunger had dulled their senses, but this scent was so potent, so deeply forgotten, that it made some of them feel dizzy. In Germany, bread was a dark, heavy thing, often stretched with sawdust or potato flour to make it last. This was the scent of a different world. And always their eyes returned to the skirts, those impossible symbols of a normality that was more shocking than any soldier's rifle. The American guards assigned to them did not comment on the prisoners' stunned silence. Perhaps they had seen this same reaction before, in other groups of defeated soldiers and auxiliaries. Perhaps they understood, in a way the prisoners themselves could not yet articulate, that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or its planes, but its quiet, unyielding ability to carry on with life as if war were merely a distant storm. The other women lay silent, each turning that image over in her mind like a forbidden photograph. For the first time since their capture, some of them felt not only fear, but a flicker of profound, unsettling curiosity. It would be a mistake to imagine these prisoners as innocent bystanders. Many had been willing cogs in the vast machine of occupation and oppression. Yet war has a way of reducing everyone, even the complicit, to the basic human need of hunger. And hunger has a way of sharpening the eye to the strangest of details. For these women, the sight of skirts in America was not just about clothing. They were tangible proof of a civilization that had endured without losing its rhythm, proof that femininity and individuality had survived while theirs had been starved into submission. The irony was a sharp, bitter pill. In Germany, the propaganda machine had glorified sacrifice, insisting that every woman must give up comfort, color, and softness to feed the insatiable ambitions of the Reich. Now those same women, stripped of their cause and their nation's pride, were confronted with a devastating truth. Across the ocean, women had worked, they had contributed to the war, and yet they still walked freely in skirts. For some, it was a feeling of pure, burning envy. For others, it was a deep, stinging humiliation. But for all of them, it was unforgettable. The skirt had become a banner of survival, stitched not in military gold, but in simple cotton and color, a quiet declaration that not every land had surrendered its soul to the fire. And yet this was only the beginning. They had seen fabric, yes, But what came next would reveal that America's abundance was not confined to clothing. It would appear in the food they were given, in the small freedoms they observed, in the laughter of women who had never known a ration book. They were about to learn that the war they had helped to fight had, in fact, been fought in another world entirely. The convoy that carried the women deeper into America rolled past fields that seemed to stretch into eternity. Vast carpets of green and gold shimmering under the late summer sun. From the open backs of the transport trucks, the German prisoners watched endless rows of corn swaying in the breeze. Past barns painted a cheerful red and white that looked like something out of a child's picture book. And past how only a distant rumor. They carried shopping bags brimming with groceries. Their hair was tied back with colorful ribbons. And most astonishing of all, they wore skirts. Skirts in colors that seemed almost defiant in their brightness. Red, navy blue, plaid, all made from cotton that caught the light. For women who had worn the same gray-issued uniform for years, who had learned to turn old flour sacks into dresses and patch their stockings until they were nothing but threadbare ropes, this casual abundance was simply incomprehensible. One prisoner, her face still etched with suspicion, muttered to the woman next to her, "Do they parade them for us on purpose?" But it was clear there was no parade. Life was simply carrying on, and it was carrying on in skirts. In Germany, the concept of fabric itself had almost vanished into the all-consuming maw of the war effort. Civilian dresses were systematically shortened, their pockets removed, their hems rationed down to mere inches. Hitler's government, through a relentless campaign of propaganda, had urged women to cast aside what it called frivolous vanity, to sacrifice color and form for the grim, gray necessity of the Reich. Even cosmetics had been stripped away by shortages and official condemnation. In those desperate years, femininity itself had become suspect, a dangerous and decadent indulgence in the face of the great national struggle. Yet here, across an ocean, femininity was not just intact, it was walking freely down Main Street with a confident smile. The prisoners began to notice even smaller, more piercing details. A teenage girl balancing on a bicycle, her skirt flaring out behind her as she pedaled. A flash of pure, unthinking joy. A mother ushering her small children into a bakery, her blouse neatly pressed, her skirt patterned with cheerful stripes. Schoolgirls skipping rope on a playground, their laughter bright and clear, their simple clothing unscarred by the telltale signs of mending. These were not grand displays of power. They were simple visions of peace, and they stung more than the barbs of any wire fence. They revealed not only America's astounding prosperity, but the depths of Germany's poverty. Clothing. The food provided in the camp, though likely modest by American standards, was a daily source of astonishment for the prisoners. On their first morning, they were served trays with white bread, coffee, beans, and sometimes, unbelievably, even meat. They had forgotten the simple taste of butter. In Germany, bread was stretched with whatever substitutes could be found: ground peas, barley husks, even sawdust. Here, the bread was soft, almost sweet, a luxury that made some of the women weep silently over their portions. One woman confessed in a letter, which she knew would be carefully censored, that her greatest shock upon arriving was being served a breakfast that looked like a Christmas feast. The statistics of the era confirmed what their senses were already telling them. By 1944, the average American civilian consumed more than 3,000 calories per day, while the average for a German civilian had plummeted to less than half that number. Rationing did exist in the United States, of course, but it never approached the soul-crushing desperation of Europe. Sugar, gasoline, tires, and coffee were managed and controlled, but there was still enough fabric for skirts,
and bakeries still filled their windows with pastries. To the German prisoners of war, America's immense plenty was not measured in abstract numbers, but in the concrete, unforgettable sight of a teenage girl spinning in a circle, her skirt flaring around her, without a single thought for fabric police or ration inspectors. There was humor, too, a nervous, brittle humor at first, which then sharpened into a coping mechanism. One evening, a young prisoner known for her sardonic wit joked, "If they had invaded us in skirts like that, we would have surrendered faster." The laughter that followed was thin, edged with a deep resentment, but it was laughter nonetheless. Even in their captivity, they could recognize the profound absurdity of their situation. They had braced themselves for iron shackles, and instead, they found themselves utterly undone by cloth. For others, the experience carried a much heavier weight. They began to think of their sisters, their mothers, and their daughters, still trapped in the ruins of Germany, patching garments until they disintegrated.
At war. In Germany, uniformity had been demanded as a patriotic duty. In America, diversity appeared to be perfectly normal. The women here could work in factories, raise children, and still wear skirts that expressed something personal, something of their own. That realization both unsettled and fascinated the prisoners. One woman, older than the rest, who had been a teacher before the war, spoke softly one night in the darkened barracks. "I thought the war had stolen everything from all of us," she said. "But perhaps it only stole from Germany." Her words lingered in the air, unchallenged, because they carried a truth too raw and too painful to deny. The camp itself became a strange theater of contrast. The guards were firm, but not cruel. The rules existed, but they were not enforced with the random, soul-crushing brutality the women had been taught to expect. Some of the guards even treated them with a kind of distant, professional courtesy. It was profoundly disorienting. They had braced themselves for revenge, for a taste of the suffering their own nation had inflicted on others. Yet what they received instead was structure, food, and these unsettling glimpses of a civilian world that seemed completely untouched by the horrors they knew. Still, it was the skirts that remained the most haunting detail. They had come to symbolize more than just prosperity. They were banners of a different kind of survival, proof that life itself could resist the immense gravity of war. Each time the prisoners were transported for work details, each time they glimpsed an American woman walking through a town, the image returned. Skirts swaying in the breeze, a splash of bright color against the gray canvas of their memory. The women did not know how to interpret what they saw. Was it arrogance? A nation flaunting its wealth in the faces of the defeated? Was it a profound carelessness, a willful blindness to the suffering that was still consuming so much of the world? Or was it something else entirely, a kind of resilience perhaps, a deep-seated determination to preserve beauty and normality even when the world had demanded nothing but sacrifice? Whatever the answer, the effect was undeniable. The German women, once the uniformed servants of a regime that had demanded— What else might this country reveal? The answer was waiting, and it would arrive not in the form of fabric, but in flavors, in freedoms, and in the unexpected sound of a child's laughter. The German women thought they had already been shocked enough, but what came next would test them in ways they had never imagined.